Picture this. You've been working towards something for years. Maybe it's the promotion. Maybe it's the apartment with the floor-to-ceiling windows in the neighborhood you always wanted. Maybe it's the relationship you were convinced would finally make everything click into place. And then, one day, you get it. You actually get it. The call comes through, or the keys are placed in your hand, or someone says yes when you've been bracing for no. For a few days, maybe a few weeks, everything feels different. You wake up lighter. The world looks sharper. You look at your life and you think, this is it. This is what I was working toward. You've arrived. And then something quiet happens. So quiet you almost miss it. The feeling fades. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, steadily, the glow dims. The apartment becomes just the apartment. The job becomes just the job. What felt like a summit starts to feel like a plateau. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a new wanting begins to take shape. Something a little bigger. Something a little further away. You tell yourself you're just ambitious, motivated, that there's nothing wrong with wanting more. But here's the thing. What if the wanting is the problem? What if the part of your brain responsible for making you feel satisfied is fundamentally, irrevocably broken? What if the very mechanism that was supposed to reward you for achieving your goals has been quietly sabotaging your happiness this entire time? This isn't a self-help story. There's no simple fix waiting at the end. What we're about to explore is one of psychology's most uncomfortable discoveries, a mechanism so deeply embedded in human neurobiology that philosophers wrote about it centuries before scientists could measure it. It's called hedonic adaptation. And once you understand it, you will never look at desire the same way again. If you're drawn to deep ideas about human nature and consciousness, you're exactly where you should be. Subscribe to Flashlight Mind, where we explore the questions that science raises but rarely answers neatly. Let's begin where all great psychology begins, with a very bad day. In the summer of 1978, a team of researchers led by Philip Brickman at Northwestern University published one of the most disquieting papers in the history of happiness research. The study was simple in design. They interviewed two groups of people. The first group, lottery winners. Major lottery winners, people who had recently received life-changing sums of money. The second group, accident victims who had been paralyzed, left paraplegic or quadriplegic following recent injuries. The researchers asked both groups to rate their current happiness, their happiness in the past, and their expected happiness in the future. Then they compared these scores against a control group of ordinary people who had experienced neither a windfall nor a catastrophe. The results were striking enough that they rewrote entire fields of research. The lottery winners were not significantly happier than the control group. In fact, Brickman and his colleagues found that winners took measurably less pleasure from ordinary everyday activities. Things like talking with a friend, buying new clothes, receiving a compliment. The peak of winning had recalibrated their baseline so severely that mundane pleasures no longer registered. And the accident victims? They had not, as most people would assume, been destroyed by their misfortune. Their happiness scores, while lower than the control group, were still above the midpoint of the scale. They were, by their own report, more happy than unhappy. And they expected to be roughly as happy as everyone else within a few years. Think about what that means for a moment. A group of people who had just won millions of dollars were not significantly happier than people who had won nothing. And a group of people who had just lost the use of their legs were not as devastated as anyone observing from the outside would have predicted. Both groups had adapted. In different directions, at different rates. But both had returned toward a stable, relatively consistent baseline of well-being that seemed to resist even the most extreme of life's upheavals. Brickman and his colleague Donald Campbell had first described this process theoretically in 1971, in a paper titled Hedonic Relativism and Planning the Good Society. It was in this paper that they first used the metaphor that would follow the concept everywhere. The hedonic treadmill. You run as hard as you can. You may even outrun the pack for a moment. But when you look down, you're still in exactly the same place. The concept wasn't entirely new, of course. The idea that pleasure is relative, that what satisfied us yesterday cannot satisfy us today, is as old as recorded thought. The ancient Stoics understood it. The Epicureans built an entire philosophy around managing it. The Buddhist teachings on suffering and impermanence touched on it from a different angle. But 1978 was the year it moved from philosophy into the laboratory, the year it was measured and quantified and shown, with uncomfortable precision, to be real. And the implications were devastating. Not just for lottery winners. For all of us. For every goal we've ever chased, every milestone we've ever celebrated, everything we've ever convinced ourselves would finally be enough. To understand why this happens, you have to go somewhere that most conversations about happiness never reach. You have to go inside the brain itself, into a distinction so fundamental that it changes how you understand every desire you've ever had. Here is the question. When you want something and then you get it, are the same parts of your brain responsible for both experiences? The wanting and the having. For decades, scientists assumed the answer was yes. The neurotransmitter dopamine was understood to be the brain's pleasure chemical. It surged when you ate something delicious, when you had sex, when you used drugs. It was the brain's way of saying, that was good, do it again. Dopamine equaled pleasure. That was the consensus. Then Kent Berridge, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan, ran an experiment that quietly demolished this assumption. It was the late 1980s, and Berridge was working with rats. He and his colleague Terry Robinson depleted the dopamine systems in the brains of the experimental rats almost entirely, using a precise neurochemical technique. The rats could barely move. They lost interest in seeking food. But here's what they found. When the researchers placed sweet food directly in the mouths of these dopamine-depleted rats, the animals still showed visible pleasure reactions. The facial expressions that indicate enjoyment in rodents, which are homologous to human expressions and recognizable across species, were still present. The rats still liked the sweet taste. They just didn't want it anymore. This was a bombshell. Dopamine, it turned out, was not the pleasure chemical. It was the wanting chemical. It mediated the drive to pursue, to seek, to crave. It had nothing to do with the hedonic experience of actually receiving what you sought. Berridge and Robinson described the brain as operating on two distinct systems. The wanting system, driven by mesolimbic dopamine circuits, is large, powerful, and extraordinarily robust. It makes reward cues magnetic. It generates anticipation, craving, motivation. It is the engine of desire. The liking system, responsible for the actual pleasurable experience of receiving a reward, is mediated by a completely different set of brain structures, tiny clusters of opioid-sensitive tissue they called hedonic hotspots. These systems are smaller, more fragile, and critically, not dependent on dopamine at all. These two systems can be decoupled. Under normal conditions, they track together reasonably well. We want things and we like things, and the two experiences cohere. But the wanting system is far more powerful, far more persistent, and far more easily amplified than the liking system. And this asymmetry is at the heart of everything that follows. Consider addiction, where this decoupling is most dramatic and most visible. A person in the grip of severe drug addiction wants the substance with terrifying intensity. But ask them whether they still enjoy it the way they did the first time, and the answer is almost always no. The wanting has been amplified to an almost inhuman degree while the liking has diminished to almost nothing. They are running full speed on a treadmill for a reward that barely registers when it arrives. But here's the insight that haunts you once you see it. This dynamic is not unique to addiction. It is the normal operating condition of the human reward system. The wanting is always larger than the liking. Anticipation is always more vivid than arrival. The dream of the thing is always more potent than the thing itself. The brain did not evolve to keep you satisfied. It evolved to keep you moving. There's a concept in psychology called affective forecasting, and it describes one of the most reliable ways that human beings are wrong about themselves. Affective forecasting is our ability to predict how we will feel in the future, how some event or outcome will affect our emotional state, and for how long. Daniel Gilbert, a professor of psychology at Harvard and the author of a book called Stumbling on Happiness, has spent his career studying this capacity. What he found is that we are systematically, predictably, almost hilariously bad at it. The specific error Gilbert documented is called impact bias, the tendency to dramatically overestimate both the intensity and the duration of our emotional responses to future events. When we imagine getting the promotion, we imagine feeling euphoric. And we imagine feeling that way for a long time. What actually happens is that we feel good for a while, and then we don't, and the timeline is much shorter than we predicted. This happens with negative events too. When we imagine a devastating breakup, we imagine being shattered for months. We imagine the grief being unbearable. What often happens is that we recover faster than predicted, and life reassembles itself with a speed that surprises us. Gilbert calls the mechanism responsible for this recovery our psychological immune system, a set of largely unconscious cognitive processes that rationalize, reframe, and reinterpret our circumstances in ways that protect our emotional equilibrium. We find silver linings. We lower our comparison standards. We decide that what we lost wasn't really what we wanted anyway. And this happens automatically, below the level of conscious reasoning, so effectively that we often don't notice we've done it. But here's the cruel irony that impact bias creates. Because we expect the good things to make us happier than they do, and we pursue them at enormous cost, and then they don't deliver what we expected, we feel something close to cheated. We don't blame the prediction. We blame the outcome. Maybe I wanted the wrong job. Maybe this apartment is good but not quite right. Maybe I just need to find a better relationship. And the cycle begins again. Gilbert once described the situation with characteristic directness. He noted that people are very good at wanting things they believe will make them happy, and very bad at actually knowing what those things are. The map we carry in our heads of the emotional landscape of our future is consistently, measurably wrong. And yet we trust it completely. This is not irrationality in the pejorative sense. It is a design feature. Or rather, it is the byproduct of a design that had other priorities in mind. Here is the evolutionary logic that no one wants to hear. Perpetual dissatisfaction is not a bug. It is the oldest feature in the human operating system. Think about what sustained contentment would have meant for your ancestors on the African savanna 100,000 years ago. An ancestor who achieved a good hunt, ate a satisfying meal, found shelter for the night, and then felt deeply, durably happy with that situation would have been at a severe disadvantage. That satisfied ancestor might not have gone out hunting tomorrow, might not have kept gathering food, might not have kept looking for better water sources or safer territory. Contentment, in an environment of constant scarcity and danger, was essentially a survival liability. The ancestors who thrived were the ones who, even after a successful hunt, after a good meal, after securing shelter, felt the quiet pull of more. Who felt the world beyond their current horizon calling to them. Who experienced satisfaction as a brief pause rather than a destination. These are the people who kept moving, kept seeking, kept adapting. And these are the people whose genes we carry. Think about the bitter precision of this. The very mechanism that makes life feel insufficient, the restlessness that makes every achievement feel transitional, was selected for because it worked. It produced more offspring. Those offspring built more, explored more, competed more effectively. The treadmill was not a malfunction in the ancestral environment. It was the engine of survival. The problem is that we are running this Pleistocene software in an environment it was never designed for. The scarcity that made perpetual desire adaptive is largely gone in the developed world, or at least radically transformed. We have solved, at the scale of societies, most of the problems that perpetual striving evolved to solve. We have calories in abundance. We have shelter available to most. We have connectivity and information that would have seemed like sorcery to even our most recent ancestors. And yet the brain keeps running the old program. Keep wanting. Keep seeking. The baseline always rises. The horizon always retreats. The hedonic treadmill, in this light, is evolution's masterwork. It keeps us striving. It prevents complacency. It ensures that no achievement ever fully quiets the hunger for the next one. It is, from a purely reproductive standpoint, an extraordinarily elegant mechanism. And from the standpoint of individual human happiness, it is absolutely merciless. Richard Easterlin, an economist then at the University of Pennsylvania, stumbled onto a macro-level version of this phenomenon in 1974. He was looking at happiness data across countries and across time, and he noticed something that seemed impossible. In the United States, real incomes had been rising steadily since World War II. People were objectively wealthier than they had ever been. By any material measure, lives were better. And yet happiness scores, as measured by large population surveys asking people simply whether they were happy, had remained essentially flat. In some measurements, they had even declined slightly. The trend held in other developed nations as well. Americans in 1990 had disposable incomes more than 3 times higher than Americans in 1940. Their happiness scores were virtually identical. Oesterlin named this observation a paradox, and it became known as the Oesterlin paradox. The fact that beyond a certain threshold, additional wealth does not appear to produce additional well-being. His explanation drew directly on the psychology of adaptation and social comparison. When everyone around you gets richer, your increased wealth doesn't feel like increased wealth. It feels like keeping up. The reference point shifts. The baseline rises. The treadmill accelerates, but you stay in the same place. We have, as a civilization, built an entire economic and cultural system premised on the idea that more is better. More money, more possessions, more status, more experiences, more followers, more approval. And the brain, wired the way it is, will always consent to this arrangement while quietly guaranteeing that the fulfillment it promises will never fully arrive. There is an industry built on this, of course. Several industries. In fact, it is not an exaggeration to say that modern consumer capitalism runs on the hedonic treadmill the way a combustion engine runs on gasoline. The entire architecture of advertising is premised on a single psychological proposition: that you are not yet satisfied, and that this product, this experience, this version of yourself, is what satisfaction looks like. The French philosopher Jean Baudrillard spent his career analyzing how consumer societies function at the level of meaning and desire. In his 1970 book, The Consumer Society, Baudrillard argued that in advanced capitalist cultures, the consumption of objects has become disconnected from their use value. We no longer buy things primarily for what they do. We buy them for what they signify. For what possessing them says about who we are, what level of status we've reached, what lifestyle we've achieved. The car is not transportation. The watch is not a timekeeping device. The neighborhood is not a place to sleep. Each is a symbol in a system of symbols, and the system is designed so that the symbols are always shifting, always stratifying, always generating new categories of enough that require new purchases to reach. Baudrillard's insight connects directly to the prediction error mechanism in the brain. When everyone in your social world has the same car, it stops being a signal of anything. The meaning evaporates. The dopamine fires in response to the acquisition, and then, once the object has been normalized, the meaning it was supposed to carry dissolves. So you need a newer model. A more distinctive one. The one that belongs to the aspirational category above you. This is not accidental. It is designed. The shortening of product cycles, the fashion industry's seasonal replacement of what is current with what is already outdated, the upgrade culture in technology. These are not just byproducts of innovation. They are mechanisms for preventing adaptation from fully neutralizing desire. If the phone you have becomes the old phone fast enough, you never fully adapt to it before the wanting begins again. In 2009, the psychologist Tim Kaiser at Knox College published a comprehensive review of research on materialism and well-being. The findings were remarkably consistent across cultures and methodologies. People who placed high importance on financial success, possessions, and status as primary life goals reported lower levels of well-being, higher rates of anxiety and depression, and less satisfying relationships than people who oriented their lives around what Kaiser called intrinsic goals: personal growth, meaningful relationships, contributing to community. The materialistic orientation wasn't just failing to produce happiness. It was actively producing its opposite. The hedonic treadmill explains why. Extrinsic goals, goals oriented toward outcomes that exist in the external world and depend on external validation, are precisely the category of goals most vulnerable to adaptation and social comparison. You get the salary and it becomes the new baseline. You get the status and the status category above you becomes visible. The treadmill is designed for this kind of running. It is almost perfectly calibrated to ensure that extrinsic goals produce permanent movement and minimal arrival. Intrinsic goals, goals oriented toward growth, connection, meaning, creativity, are harder to fully achieve, and therefore harder to fully adapt to. A relationship that is genuinely deepening over time doesn't allow full adaptation because it is always presenting new dimensions. A creative practice that is genuinely engaging doesn't allow full adaptation because the edge of capability keeps moving as skill develops. These goals have built into them the kind of productive uncertainty and novelty that the dopamine system responds to. They generate reward by maintaining the gap between aspiration and achievement at a size that motivates without crushing. This is not a perfect solution. No solution is. But it suggests that the direction in which you orient your desire matters enormously. Let's return to the laboratory for a moment, because the neuroscience gets stranger and more unsettling the deeper you go. The wanting system, the dopamine circuits that drive pursuit, has a property that makes hedonic adaptation almost mechanically inevitable. Dopamine neurons do not respond to rewards. They respond to unexpected rewards. More precisely, they respond to the difference between expected and actual rewards, what neuroscientists call prediction error. When something good happens that you didn't expect, dopamine fires intensely. When something good happens exactly as predicted, dopamine response is muted. When something good happens that you expected but doesn't happen, dopamine dips below baseline. Your brain is not tracking absolute pleasures. It is tracking departures from prediction. This is why novelty feels so electric and familiarity feels so flat. The first time you hear a piece of music that devastates you, the dopamine response is enormous. By the 100th listen, even if you still appreciate the music intellectually, the emotional wallop is smaller. The brain has updated its predictions. It knows what's coming. The surprise is gone, and with it, much of the neurochemical punch. Apply this to the things we chase in life. The first apartment of your own. The first real salary. The first relationship that actually works. All of these experiences are novel, unpredicted, and they trigger powerful dopamine responses. But the 20th month in that apartment, the 3rd year at that salary, the 4th year in that relationship, all of these are predicted, expected. And the dopamine response, which was never measuring the quality of the thing itself but only its novelty relative to expectation, has already moved on. This is why the rich seem to need to spend increasingly extravagant amounts to feel anything. It is why people who have achieved genuine success often describe a kind of internal emptiness that confuses and disturbs them. It is why the arrival at any destination begins, almost immediately, to feel less like an arrival and more like a staging point. The brain has not failed. It has succeeded spectacularly at exactly what it was designed to do: keep you searching for more. There is a woman named Sarah, a marketing director in her mid-30s, who described her experience to a researcher in a study on workplace well-being in 2023. She had spent 5 years working toward a senior vice president role at a large company in Chicago. The role represented a significant pay increase, substantial new authority, and the kind of title that she had been told, by mentors and by culture, would mean she had made it. She got the role in November of that year. She remembered sitting in her new office, on the first full day, looking out at a view of the Chicago skyline, and waiting for the feeling to arrive. The feeling she had been promised. The feeling she had been banking on for 5 years. It came, she said. It was real. For about 3 weeks. By January, she was already thinking about what came next. Not with joy, not with ambition, but with a kind of compulsion. A low-level anxiety that had, without her fully noticing, transferred itself from the goal she had been pursuing to the goals she hadn't yet identified. The treadmill had not stopped. It had only changed settings. She described it as grief, actually. Grief for the version of her life that was supposed to begin when she arrived. The version where she finally felt settled, and content, and whole. That version never showed up. And she found herself mourning it while sitting in the office she had worked so hard to occupy. Sarah's experience is not unusual. It is, in fact, the norm. The research on post-achievement emotional states is remarkably consistent. The anticipatory pleasure of working toward a goal is typically more sustained and more intense than the pleasure of achieving it. The journey is often, neurochemically, more rewarding than the destination. And yet the destination is all we can see when we're moving toward it. Psychologists call this phenomenon focalism, a term developed by Daniel Gilbert and his collaborator Timothy Wilson. When we imagine a future event, we focus almost exclusively on that event itself, stripping away everything else that will still be present in our lives when it occurs. The job promotion looms so large in our imagining that we forget about the commute, the office politics, the unchanged relationships, the persistent insomnia, the bills that still need paying. We experience the imagined event in isolation. We experience the actual event in the full context of our entire life, which looks mostly the same as before. The mismatch between what we imagined and what we received is not really about the thing itself. It's about the narrowness of our imagination. We've talked about the treadmill speeding up when we get what we want. Now consider what happens when it does the opposite. In 2006, the philosopher Martha Nussbaum wrote a remarkable passage about the experience of loss. She described how we adapt to loss not through becoming indifferent, but through a kind of reweaving of the self, a process in which the absence of what we love becomes, slowly, a part of who we are rather than a wound in who we are. The psychological immune system that Daniel Gilbert described does its work here too. But it's worth noticing that it works asymmetrically. Research has consistently found that people adapt more quickly and more completely to positive events than to negative ones. The lottery win fades faster than the car accident. The good news stops feeling good sooner than the bad news stops feeling bad. This asymmetry has its own evolutionary logic. Ongoing vigilance about negative events, about threats and losses and dangers, is more survival relevant than sustained enjoyment of positive ones. The brain allocates its adaptive resources accordingly, which means that the misery we dread tends to be more durable than the joy we seek, a truth that makes the hedonic treadmill even harder to step off than it first appears. But there is something even more counterintuitive buried in the research. Uncertainty about an outcome, it turns out, can actually prolong positive emotional responses. In a series of studies conducted by Timothy Wilson and his colleagues at the University of Virginia, people who received a positive event but were not told all the details of it, who were left with some mystery about exactly what had happened and why, reported higher levels of happiness for longer periods than people who were given a full explanation. When we understand something completely, we adapt to it more quickly. The inexplicable, the uncertain, the not fully resolved, resists the brain's hunger to categorize and neutralize. This is a strange finding. It suggests that part of what makes good things stop feeling good is our very drive to understand them. The moment we have fully explained our joy, categorized it, located its source and its mechanism, the joy begins to leave. The brain, having understood, moves on. Which raises a question about whether the secret to resisting the treadmill might be not to explain so much. To sit with the inexplicable. To resist the urge to categorize and rationalize every good thing that happens to you. To let some things remain mysterious. There is a concept in Buddhism called upadana, which is often translated as clinging or attachment. The basic idea is that suffering arises not from experience itself, but from our relationship to experience, specifically from our tendency to grasp at pleasant things when they arise and resist unpleasant things when they arise. The hedonic treadmill is, in a sense, the neuroscientific operationalization of this ancient insight. What Buddhism has always understood, and what Western psychology is now confirming through increasingly sophisticated measurement tools, is that the self's relationship to pleasure is inherently unstable. Not because pleasure is an illusion, but because the same cognitive apparatus that allows us to experience pleasure also inevitably habituates to it. The Stoic philosophers approached this from a different angle. Epictetus, a Roman Stoic writing in the 1st century, spent considerable time on the distinction between what is and is not in our control. His central argument was that if your well-being is contingent on external things, on outcomes and acquisitions and the opinions of others, you have placed your happiness in circumstances that are inherently unstable. The only reliable foundation for equanimity, he argued, is the quality of your own reasoning and the orientation of your own will. The hedonic treadmill is, in Stoic terms, precisely what happens when you ignore this. When you stake your peace on external conditions, you have made yourself a permanent captive of the gap between what you have and what the treadmill is telling you need. What both of these traditions understood, long before anyone could measure dopamine, is something profound about the structure of desire itself. Wanting is not the path to having. Wanting is a destination in itself. And the brain, once satisfied, simply generates more wanting to fill the space. If ideas like these fascinate you, if you find yourself returning again and again to the question of why human beings seem constitutionally unable to rest in what they have, subscribe to Flashlight Mind. This is where we explore these questions every week, with the depth and rigor they deserve. If you've been with me this far, you might be wondering whether there's any way out, whether the treadmill can be slowed, whether the neuroscience offers any hope, or whether we're simply sentenced to perpetual dissatisfaction by the architecture of our own brains. The research here is genuinely nuanced, and I want to be honest with you about what it does and doesn't say. Psychologists Kenan Sheldon and Sonia Lyubomirsky, both prominent happiness researchers, proposed what they called the Hedonic Adaptation Prevention Model, or HAP model, in 2012. Their central finding was that adaptation to positive changes proceeds through two main channels, and that disrupting either channel can slow the rate of adaptation. The first channel, the stream of positive emotions generated by a change, diminishes over time. Things that felt fresh and exciting become familiar. The second channel, more counterintuitive, is that the change increases aspirations. What used to seem wonderful now seems merely adequate, because it has become the baseline against which newer, larger aspirations are measured. To slow adaptation through the first channel, Sheldon and Lyubomirsky found that variety within positive experiences helps. If you've just started a new job, the novelty of the job itself will wear off. But novelty within the experience, different tasks, different approaches, deliberate variation, can sustain engagement for longer. The brain's dopamine system, remember, fires in response to prediction error. Introduce uncertainty and variation, and you reintroduce the element of novelty that keeps the system engaged. To slow adaptation through the second channel, the key is appreciation. Not the forced, performed gratitude of self-help culture, but a genuine, cognitive practice of noticing the ways in which your current circumstances differ from less favorable alternatives. Brickman himself, in his original lottery winner study, noted that the winners had lost access to simple pleasures that the control group still enjoyed. They had adapted to a higher baseline and could no longer as easily appreciate the ordinary. Consciously interrupting this process, deliberately savoring rather than simply consuming, appears to slow its momentum. There is also strong and consistent evidence for what Lyubomirsky has called activity-based approaches to happiness, as opposed to circumstance-based ones. Changes in circumstances, the new apartment, the new salary, the new relationship status, produce relatively short boosts in well-being because we adapt to circumstances efficiently. But certain kinds of activities, particularly those involving genuine engagement, novelty, social connection, and contribution to others, produce more sustained well-being precisely because they are harder to fully adapt to. An activity that generates meaningful connection or genuine challenge resists the brain's habituation mechanisms better than a static possession. None of this is a cure. The treadmill doesn't stop, but the pace at which it runs is not entirely outside of your influence. In 1996, a psychologist named David Lukin, working with his colleague Auk Tellegen at the University of Minnesota, published the results of a remarkable study. They had been following more than 1,000 sets of twins for over a decade, comparing identical twins, who share virtually all their genetic material, with fraternal twins, who share roughly half. They were trying to determine how much of our happiness, our stable baseline level of well-being, is inherited rather than determined by circumstances. Their finding was that roughly 50% of the variation in happiness between individuals appears to be attributable to genetic factors. Not circumstance. Not achievement. Not relationship status or income or where you live or what you own. Genetics. Each person, it appeared, has a kind of affective set point, a baseline level of well-being around which their happiness oscillates in response to life events, and toward which it tends to return. Lottery win. It lifts you above your set point temporarily. Spinal cord injury. It pushes you below it temporarily. But the set point itself, influenced substantially by genetics, remains relatively stable. Lukin said something memorable after publishing the study. He suggested that trying to be significantly happier than your set point might be as difficult as trying to be significantly taller. The architecture is set. You can work within it, optimize around it, build better habits and relationships and practices. But the floor and ceiling of your emotional life are, to a substantial degree, already built into you. There's a man I want you to think about. His name was Michael, and he grew up in what most people would describe as difficult circumstances. A volatile household in Cleveland, limited resources, and interrupted education. By his late 30s, he had built a genuinely successful small business, had 2 children he adored, and lived in a comfortable house in a suburb he'd once only driven through. By most external measures, his life was significantly better than the one he'd come from. And yet he described himself to a therapist, with some guilt and confusion, as feeling about the same as he'd always felt. Not depressed, not without pleasure or purpose, but hovering around what he could only describe as a kind of thermostat setting. Good days and bad days, but always returning to the same temperature. What Michael was describing was his set point. The therapist recognized it immediately. And the insight that was useful to Michael was not that he should pursue more, that his good fortune hadn't registered correctly and needed to be amplified. The useful insight was that the absence of dramatic happiness elevation was not an indictment of his life. It was not evidence that something was wrong with what he had built. It was simply the nature of how human emotional systems work. That reframe changed something for him. He stopped measuring his life against the feeling he expected his achievements to produce. He started paying attention to what was actually present. This finding was seized upon by some as depressing, as a kind of determinism about joy. But I think it points to something different. If happiness is largely stable regardless of circumstance, then the desperate project of acquiring circumstances, of chasing the promotion and the apartment and the relationship and the body and the salary, is not only neurologically futile but ontologically misguided. You are not your circumstances. The quality of your inner life has a grammar that is largely independent of external events. The Stoics would have nodded. The Buddhists would have nodded. The data, after decades of measurement and refinement, is also nodding. We need to talk about comparison. Because the hedonic treadmill doesn't run in isolation. It runs on a track built partly by the people around you. Social comparison theory, first formulated by the social psychologist Leon Festinger in 1954, describes our tendency to evaluate our own circumstances, abilities, and opinions by comparing them to those of others. This is not vanity or weakness. It is a basic cognitive function, one of the primary ways the brain calibrates what is adequate, sufficient, successful, and desirable. There are two directions comparison can run. Upward comparison, looking at people who appear to be doing better than you, tends to generate aspiration, but also dissatisfaction, envy, and a sense of inadequacy. Downward comparison, looking at people who appear worse off, temporarily boosts mood. Healthy psychological functioning involves some capacity to move between both. But the environments we've constructed for ourselves today have made one of these almost irresistible and the other almost invisible. The problem is that social comparison hijacks the hedonic baseline in a way that goes beyond individual adaptation. Your happiness is not just relative to your own past. It's relative to a social reference group. And when that reference group changes, your baseline changes with it. Richard Easterlin's data showed this at the national level. In a country that is growing wealthier together, the gains of individual wealth are partly offset by the fact that everyone's comparison point has shifted upward simultaneously. You feel richer than your past self, but roughly equivalent to your neighbors. And it is the comparison to neighbors that the brain weights most heavily when evaluating well-being. Today, this mechanism operates at a scale and intensity that has no historical precedent. Social media has made the comparison group effectively infinite and the most favorable comparison always visible. You are no longer comparing yourself to your neighbors, your colleagues, your peers. You are comparing yourself to the most curated, most successful, most photogenic version of everyone in your extended digital world, filtered through algorithms designed to maximize engagement by maximizing aspiration. Consider the specific cruelty of this arrangement. The algorithm is not interested in your well-being. It is interested in your attention. And nothing captures attention more reliably than a gap between where you are and where you could be. The perfectly composed kitchen. The vacation that looks like a film set. The relationship that broadcasts contentment like a transmission from a better reality. These images are not lies exactly, but they are extractions from the fullness of a life, curated specifically to activate the comparison mechanism and produce the wanting that keeps you scrolling. The result is a version of the hedonic treadmill that runs faster than anything our evolutionary psychology was built to handle. The baseline keeps rising. The thing you have, no matter how genuinely good, is always adjacent to the digital projection of what you could have, should have, might have. The gap between actual and imagined never closes because the imagined is a production, not a life. In 2021, researchers at the University of Exeter published an analysis of social media use and subjective well-being in adolescents. Their findings were consistent with a decade of similar research. Passive social media consumption, scrolling without engaging, was associated with lower well-being. And the mechanism appeared to be precisely social comparison. The experience of looking at others' curated lives activated the comparison mechanisms in ways that reliably made participants feel worse about their own. This is not a bug in the system. It is the system. There is something almost tragic about this arrangement when you sit with it long enough. We have taken an ancient neural mechanism that evolved to help small groups of humans calibrate their standing within tight-knit communities, and we have wired it into an architecture that exposes it simultaneously to millions of curated performances of success. The mechanism cannot distinguish between a real neighbor doing slightly better than you and a professional influencer who employs a team to construct the impression of a life you could never replicate. It responds to both with the same ancient signal: you are behind. Keep moving. We were not built for this. And yet here we are. Let's go somewhere that rarely appears in conversations about hedonic adaptation. Let's go to death. Not morosely, but seriously. Because the philosopher Irvin Yalom has argued that awareness of our mortality is one of the few forces powerful enough to interrupt the hedonic treadmill in a meaningful way. Yalom spent decades working as a psychiatrist with terminally ill patients. What he observed over and over was a phenomenon he called the awakening experience. Faced with genuine confrontation with mortality, usually through a serious diagnosis or a close brush with death, many of his patients reported a sudden and dramatic shift in what they valued. The trivial urgencies that had consumed their daily attention fell away. The things they had been planning to appreciate when they finally had time, relationships, beauty, simple pleasures, became immediately, vividly important. The habituated background of their life snapped back into focus. This is related to a concept researchers call mortality salience, the degree to which death is psychologically present in your awareness. Studies in terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Piszczynski in the 1980s, showed that reminders of mortality tend to produce one of two responses. The first, more common in people without developed coping frameworks, is a compensatory doubling down on the values and behaviors that provide a sense of symbolic immortality, consuming more, achieving more, asserting status more. The treadmill speeds up as a response to the reminder that it will one day stop. The second response, more associated with mature psychological integration, is a genuine reorientation toward what actually matters. A loosening of the grip on the things that don't. A renewed attention to the present moment rather than the imagined future. Yalom described working with a woman in her early 50s who had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and had perhaps a year to live. She had spent most of her adult life in furious social competition, terrified of appearing less successful or less interesting than the women in her social circle. After her diagnosis, this fear simply evaporated. She described looking at her old preoccupations the way you might look at a photograph of yourself doing something embarrassing as a child. They seemed remote, small, almost incomprehensible. She began, in the remaining months of her life, to do things she had postponed indefinitely. She reconnected with people she loved. She said things she had been too afraid to say. She paid attention, she told Yalom, to things she had been looking at without seeing for decades. The quality of light in the late afternoon. The actual flavor of a cup of coffee. The faces of the people she loved. She had stepped off the treadmill. Not by choice, but by being stripped of the illusion that there would always be more time to step off it later. Here is where the philosophy becomes genuinely difficult, because there is an argument to be made that the hedonic treadmill is not entirely the enemy. Consider what life might look like without it. A human being who fully adapted to their current circumstances and felt permanently satisfied would have almost no motivation to change those circumstances. The engine of human progress, the restlessness that built cities and explored continents and sent rockets to the moon, is in large part the engine of dissatisfaction. The conviction that what we have is not quite enough, that the horizon holds something better, that the work is never finished. Remove that conviction and you might remove everything that comes from it. There is a philosophical tradition that has grappled with this directly. Friedrich Nietzsche, writing in the 1880s, described the will to power not as a desire for domination over others, but as the fundamental drive of all life toward expansion, growth, overcoming. The will to persist, to become more, to push against limits. Nietzsche would have recognized the hedonic treadmill as not only inevitable but essential. The person who has stopped wanting, in his view, has stopped truly living. Albert Camus, the French-Algerian philosopher writing 50 years later, offered a different approach to the same problem. In his essay on the myth of Sisyphus, Camus took the figure of a man condemned for eternity to push a boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down and begin again. For Camus, Sisyphus was not a figure of tragedy. He was a figure of rebellion. His task was absurd, his effort without ultimate purpose, his outcome always the same. And yet Camus insisted, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because the task is rewarding, but because the engagement with the task, the full commitment to the effort even in the face of its futility, is itself a form of meaning. The treadmill doesn't stop, but you can choose how to run on it. The psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who spent his career studying optimal human experience, described what he called flow states, those periods of complete absorption in a challenging activity where the usual self-monitoring drops away and time stops feeling like a resource being spent. In flow, people typically report being too engaged to be dissatisfied. Not because their circumstances are perfect, but because their attention is fully occupied. The wanting system has something to grip. The gap between where you are and where you want to be has narrowed to a productive dimension, small enough to motivate but large enough to require effort. Csikszentmihalyi's research suggested that flow is most reliably produced by activities where the challenge slightly exceeds the current level of skill, where there is clear feedback on progress, and where the goals are specific enough to provide direction. These conditions, interestingly, are precisely the conditions under which the hedonic treadmill runs most productively. Not grinding dissatisfaction with what you have. Not frantic pursuit of an imagined destination. But active engagement with the genuine edge of your capacity. Maybe the question was never how to stop wanting. Maybe it was always about choosing, with some degree of awareness, what to want. There is something that the research on hedonic adaptation rarely says plainly, but that seems to follow from everything it shows. The futures we imagine almost never arrive. Not because we fail to reach them, but because the self that reaches them is not the self that imagined them. We adapt. We change. We metabolize our achievements into baselines. And then we stand at the summit of what we climb toward and discover that it is not a summit at all, but an outcropping that reveals another slope, and another horizon, and another distance we had not seen from below. This is not a failure of ambition. It is a feature of consciousness. Of the strange fact that we live not only in the present but in the future we imagine and the past we remember, and the brain does not draw clean lines between these. The wanting and the having exist in different temporal registers, and the gap between them is where most of a human life gets spent. What the research points toward, tentatively and with appropriate scientific caution, is that the activities and relationships and states of being that are most resistant to hedonic adaptation share certain qualities. They involve genuine novelty, not manufactured novelty but real engagement with the unknown. They involve other people in ways that are not merely transactional. They involve contribution, making something that extends beyond yourself. And perhaps most surprisingly, they involve a kind of attention that is present rather than acquisitive. Looking at what is rather than calculating what could replace it. None of these are easy. None of them are permanent. The treadmill never stops. But the direction you run on it, and the intention with which you run, these are things that remain, at least partially, in your hands. Philip Brickman, who first measured the hedonic treadmill in the summer of 1978, and whose work launched decades of research into adaptation and well-being, died by suicide in 1982. He was 38 years old. The people who knew him described a man who thought deeply about suffering and meaning, who had devoted his professional life to understanding why humans couldn't hold on to happiness. Whether the knowledge tormented him or simply couldn't save him is not something anyone can say with certainty. What I do know is that there is something in his story that resists easy framing. He mapped the treadmill with extraordinary precision. He showed us the mechanism. He gave us the language to describe it. And then the mechanism claimed him anyway. The knowledge of a trap does not always constitute an exit. But here is where I want to leave you. Not with despair and not with false comfort, but with the strange, uncomfortable, genuinely philosophical space that the hedonic treadmill opens up. If happiness is not a destination, if the feeling of arrival always dissolves into the feeling of wanting more, if the brain is built to guarantee that no achievement will feel like enough for long enough, then the question of what you do with your one finite life becomes unmoored from its usual anchors. It can no longer be answered by pointing to goals and outcomes. It has to be answered from somewhere else entirely. Maybe from the quality of attention you bring to ordinary things. Maybe from the depth of engagement you sustain with the people around you. Maybe from the willingness to feel what is actually present rather than constantly scanning for what the treadmill says is missing. Maybe, as the Stoics insisted, from the orientation of your own will. Not toward what you can acquire, but toward what you can be in relation to what you already have. The treadmill runs. It will always run. The question is whether you're running with it, or whether somewhere, in the midst of all that motion, you find something that actually holds still. What do you think? Is there a way out of the hedonic treadmill, or is the chase itself where meaning lives? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. Leave it in the comments. And if these questions are the kind that keep you up at night, the kind you've never quite been able to stop asking, subscribe to Flashlight Mind. This is what we do here. Every week, another deep dive into the psychology and philosophy of being human in a world that rarely makes complete sense. New videos every week. Come think with us.